So Raiders are cheaper, pain tokens are better, and Archons can finally join Incubi. But perhaps the most surprising change out of the balanced data slate for the Drukhari was getting a new and very strong detachment, packing some enormous damage and movement shenanigans out of transports. Hello and welcome back to Warspecs Tactics, where today I thought we'd talk through the Drukhari Skysplinter Assault Force, a new detachment for the Dark Kin, and honestly one that I think looks very scary with the first read of the rules. I feel like between this and the points cut, Drukhari are going to be an army that people have to take seriously once more. Let's talk through the context of the detachment, then through all the rules, and finish up with one very quick army list idea and a few thoughts as to the detachment as a whole. First up, I would say that this detachment is perhaps the single biggest surprise out of the balanced data slate for Warhammer 40k 10th edition. In the data slates, generally armies tend to get points changes and maybe the odd rules change. The idea is usually to try and make tweaks to balance factions against each other. They do occasionally give factions new and interesting rules, though arguably they already did that with the Drukhari and making their pain tokens a bit better in melee. That genuinely does make them more helpful. Plus on top of that, Games Workshop seem to have given them a detachment as a bit of a sorry for making you the weakest faction in Warhammer 40k, and I really wouldn't be too surprised if in future balanced data slates, Games Workshop winds up giving out a new detachment to the army that's been suffering the most in the tournament statistics and things. I'd argue that this one isn't really a balance enhancement, it's more just for fun and giving Drukhari players another way to play. They certainly could have balanced the faction just literally by making points and rules changes from the detachment that they already have, so this one is more a nice to have, though given the state of these rules, I feel like it's going to add loads of power to the faction. This has all happened in context of really quite big Drukhari buffs besides this. Plenty of units went down and often by fairly meaningful amounts. Raiders, Venoms, Talos, Hellions, Reavers, Incubi, Drazar, and a few more. Lots of points decreases, and now pain tokens make units a lot more dangerous in melee as well, giving you extra AP there too. Archons can also lead Incubi, and between having extra AP and reroll wound rolls as a potential for them, that definitely feels like it makes them a lot more dangerous to me. Overall, it definitely feels like it's going to be a massively feel good update for the Darkkin. Let's take a look at the actual rules on offer though, and the detachment is called the Skysplinter Assault. This one represents a Drukhari fighting force, fighting entirely from within skimmers and other craft. It's really quite transport heavy, and the vast majority of its rules revolve around transports, though this really is no bad thing for the Drukhari in-game, given that that's usually the way that they classically get their squads into combat. The whole archetype of the army is kind of built around lightish infantry fighting from raiders and venoms, and maybe isn't so very different from real space raiders. I guess that's a bit more combined arms, maybe thinking about taking some homunculus pain engines or witch beast packs along. Just based on what the other codexes have given, I wouldn't be too surprised if the other detachments that the Drukhari get when they get their codex might be for the Cabals, Cults, and Covens respectively, maybe one focused around each of those sub-factions and trying to make them work a bit more as their own army in their own right. Rules-wise though, there's no restrictions on what you can take in the detachment. Like most of them in Warhammer 40k, you can take what you want, but the boosts and power will generally go to certain units within the army. The core rule of the Skysplinter Assault is called Reign of Cruelty. This one is a damage boost for units that have just gotten out of transports, and this one gives you a damage boost until the end of the turn. Ranged units get to ignore cover with ranged weapons, and melee units get lance when they're charging, so that would give them a +1 to wound the target they've just impacted. Ignored cover is definitely meaningful. Cover saves are really quite easy to come by in 10th edition, though I would argue that it's probably not the better of the two. I feel like that lance melee buff is probably the most interesting, getting a +1 to wound on units that tend to be, say, strength 3 or strength 4 or around that sort of power. That's really quite a big damage boost and is going to amplify their power massively against things that they'd be wounding on a 5 or a 6. Just that rule in itself makes this a much better detachment for running melee Drukhari compared with the real space raid, though it's definitely helped out by a few of the supporting rules, many of which are combat focused. Seems nice for other Incubi besides Drazar's unit that already gets +1 to wound, witches with their flurries of light attacks or maybe grotesques. And just as a core rule for the detachment, it feels way better than the real space raid one, which only generates you a few additional pain tokens, and a lot of people don't even bother filling the HQ requirements to get that. Plus I don't really feel like it makes you go too far out of your way. In general, Drukhari armies do tend to be focused around their transports, so an army archetype that does that really isn't making you play so very differently. Overall, I think it's a fairly good core rule. Moving on to the stratagems though, I feel like the stratagems are my favourite bit of the detachment. They've got a whole load of power here in all sorts of different ways. Maybe one of the most niche ones is called Vicious Blades. This is one command point for having a transport in combat, and per embarked model within the transport, you basically get a chance to get a mortal wound on the opponent. For every model within the transport, you get to roll a dice, and on a 5+, you generate a mortal wound, capped to a maximum of 6. It means that, say, with a raider with 10 models embarked, you'd average about 3 or 4, though you do get a boost that if it's racks embarked within the transport, you get to get that mortal wound on a 4+, not a 5+. So I guess a unit of 10 racks would be around about 5 mortal wounds, maybe even averaging more if you've got a homunculus in there. Averaging that sort of damage for 1 CP I think really isn't too bad. Seems like a kind of fun alternative Drukhari way for tank shock, and definitely emphasises the transports and melee sort of theme that this detachment seems to have. Next we've got Wraithlight Retreat for 1 CP. This one allows you to do a fallback or a normal move for an infantry unit that's just fought in melee, seemingly whether or not you've killed your foe. And it happens at the end of the fight phase, so the opponent would get the chance to strike back if you haven't managed to kill them. If you happen to be a witches unit, then they can just move anywhere, basically disengaging from combat, maybe getting movement towards an objective if it makes sense, or just being ready to strike again, as you could use this in your opponent's fight phase if you got charged. Otherwise though, for most units, they have to try and end within 3 inches of a transport and embark within that transport. Kind of handy to have your unit no longer exposed. Theoretically, you could have a unit charge out of a transport, kill an enemy unit, and then re-embark safe within sight. Seems quite nice for otherwise fragile toughness 3 infantry. Overall I quite like this one, and it really is quite a powerful movement shenanigan for an army that might have a fair few melee units and transports. Next up for 1 CP we have Pounce on the Prey. This one feels like it might be the really big one of the detachment, as it allows you to charge after disembarking even if the transport has moved. It's basically the Land Raider Assault Ramp type special rule but for Drukhari, and Drukhari vehicles can move very quickly indeed. You could have a raider move 14 inches, have the unit disembark 3 inches out the front of it, and then go on to make a 7-inch charge after that. They could roll higher, but I guess that's the average, so that would mean an average threat range of 24 inches. That's a pretty ridiculous charge threat range really. Means that you could be hitting the enemy with a unit of 10 incubi at that sort of crazy distance, or with the lance for +1 to wound when they charge in as well, so they're likely to be pretty effective against their targets, and it could be pretty big just for objective skirmishing as well, say throwing a unit of racks halfway across the board to suddenly take an objective that the opponent would otherwise have safe. I feel like this one might be a really big draw to the detachment. Big units using this, threatening crazy charges, seems really fun. For 1 CP, there's Skyborn Annihilation. This one gives sustained hits 1 for a unit that's just disembarked, or sustained hits 2 for Kabbalite warriors, and it's used in the shooting phase. Given the units that the Drukhari have access to, it does really seem like this one is just intended for Kabbalite warriors, but to be honest, for a maxed out unit with a pain token, it really doesn't seem awful at all. If you had a unit with an Archon in it and used the pain token, you'd have a unit that gets to reroll all hits, reroll all wounds, gets sustained hits 2 for any 6s to hit, and then also ignores cover to boot as they've just jumped out of a raider. Between all that, that's really quite brutal damage output, even with the slightly mixed weapons that the Kabbalite warriors get. Feels like it could be very powerful indeed if you spike high and roll that 6 with a Dark Lance or Blaster. Next up we have Rotated Iron Shields but Drukhari with Night Shield. This one is a vehicle unit 1 and you get a 4+ invulnerable save when the enemy nominates you as the target of a shooting attack. A very nice one there. It increases the normal 6+ invulnerable save that you'd normally get to a 4+1, and often that might make the difference of literally saving on a 6 versus saving on a 4 if your opponent had some decent AP on their shooting. Really nice versus anti-tank fire. I think that this one will absolutely get used. Having a 50-50 chance to bounce last cannon shots away is a big thing indeed, and it means that your opponent could definitely spike unlucky. Finally, for 1 CP we have Swooping Mockery, a 6-inch reactive move for a Drukhari transport vehicle, and it happens if the enemy moves within 9 inches of them. As with other places, reactive moves can be really quite big. Potentially if they move too close, you could tuck your transport a little bit safer, perhaps out of line of sight, or maybe just backpedal from a charge from a melee unit that really wanted to be in combat with you. You could also use it to scoot the transport next to a piece of terrain, which would be a good place to jump out if the transport gets shot down. Then the rest of the units could hide behind that terrain and then counter-attack in your own turn. Loads of possibilities with this, and seems like a bit of a nightmare for an army that's trying to catch up by a whole bunch of scary Drukhari things in transports. Overall, I feel like the stratagems are perhaps the single best reason to play this detachment. Pretty much all of them are at least usable, and some of them are outright really strong. Pounce on the Prey is just excellent for delivering melee units reliably. I feel like that's going to be the one to build around. The Re-embark one and the reactive move are both great in the right situation, and Night Shield and Skyborn Annihilation could genuinely be used turn after turn if you wanted. Drukhari players are going to be spoiled for choice with which stratagem they use here. Finally, for the detachment, we come to enhancements. Phantasmal Smoke is 20 points, and this one gives you stealth and the benefit of cover when you're within 6 inches of a transport. Maybe it could be okay to try and lose a few less incubi when you get targeted. Having cover plus -1 to hit seems like quite a nice combo for them. Could be okay for a quarter of an Archon, a Beast Pack, or Rax or something though. 20 points is maybe a little bit borderline, but feels like it's a nice to have if you do have those points spare. The Sadistic Fulcrum is 15 points. This allows you to empower a transport as well as the bearer's unit that's targeted with a pain token, though you do have to be quite close by, within 3 inches. This one seems like you could get some serious value out of that if, say, you had a Cavalite Warrior squad that had disembarked, empower that with a pain token, and then also use it to empower another raider nearby, maybe with another Cavalite Warrior squad embarked on that. Out of 1 pain token, you could have both Cavalite Warrior squads re-rolling hits, and also the Dark Lance that the raider could chip in. Seems really quite nice, could be a fun one to build around. For 10 points, Spiteful Raider allows you to gain an extra pain token if you kill an enemy on an objective in the fight phase only. This one feels a little bit situational, but definitely doesn't seem out of the realms of possibility with something like a masked up witches or incubi squad making charges at that big long range. Seems like an okay one to throw on a unit if you happen to have a big melee unit and you have 10 points left at the end of the list. And finally, for 20 points, there's the Nightmare Shroud. This one turns off Overwatch versus this unit. If you do have one of those big investment units to make big plays like the Witches or the Incubi, then again this does seem like it could be a pretty good choice for that. It's maybe a little bit awkward in that it's not going to be relevant in really quite a lot of games that you play, but just every so often where you're facing a foe that would have just obliterated your unit with Overwatch before they got to do anything, it could be absolutely game changing. Overall, I'd rate these as kind of fine, maybe not enormously stand out compared with some of the stratagem options, but I'd say that any of them could have a use depending on exactly how your units are set up. I think probably my favourite one might be the Sadistic Fulcrum for the dual pain token thing, though it does perhaps feel like you'd be wanting to use multiple units of Cabalite Warriors as damage dealers, which maybe isn't the way to go. Overall, just from first impressions, I would guess that this is probably going to be the detachment that people tend to use for competitive Drukhari over the real space raid, and it also lines up rather nicely with a few of the points changes for the army. I think Incubi going down, as well as the Raiders and Venoms getting cheaper, is really quite good news for this particular detachment, as is the change to the pain tokens for getting extra AP when you're fighting in melee if you expend one there. Looks like it's got some good value for basically any of the infantry units. Grotesques could potentially be pretty fun with it as well. Any fairly credible threat that can charge all the way from 24 inches away though is pretty big. Getting the Alpha Strike at that sort of range is pretty massive. Finally, just for one very quick thrown together army list idea, here's just one thing that you could do with it. In reality, it would probably make sense to go a bit more balanced, but I thought just let's make an army list with a massive amount of units and raiders. So here we have an army with 6 full raiders, all full of different squads, 3 units of Cabalite Warriors, 1 unit of 10 Incubi, 1 unit of 10 Racks, and 1 unit of 10 Witches. The Witches will be headed up by Lilith Hesperax, the Incubi maybe with the Archon or ready to use a pain token, and all of those units can be good users of the many great stratagems that the detachment has. Drop and charge with the Incubi, then the Witches, one turn after another. Potentially threaten the Mortal Wound one with the Racks if it makes sense, or maybe the sustained hits with the Cabalites if you're feeling generous. There's then 2 units of Racks in Venoms for just some fast moving objective holders, 1 unit of Mandrakes to hold up the midfield and maybe fade away doing secondary things. And then just to round off the list, 3 Ravagers with Dark Lances, just trying to stick with the skimmer sort of theme and could be okay for the Night Shield stratagem. You definitely could change that round for things like some Talos or Kronos or some Scourges if you wanted that more. It does seem that after the points changes you can fit really quite a lot of Drukhari in a list, basically 80 infantry models and 11 skimmers here, quite a big raiding fleet indeed. In any case though, let me know your thoughts on the Skysplinter Assault Force for the Drukhari. Would this be the one that you Drukhari players out there are playing in game versus real space raid? And for people who might be playing against it, would this be enough to spook you with the really big long charges and the more dangerous melee? If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Allspets Tactics. I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming. I do tend to post new ones just about every day. I'll certainly be covering plenty more stuff from the balanced data slate. I've already made 3 videos already on the subject, so feel free to check those out already, and I'll be back for a few more faction focused reviews later. Finally, if you have been enjoying the videos on the channel and you'd like to help support, I would just like to mention that Allspets Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, which you can find linked in the video description if you'd like to help keep these videos coming. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.